Hi, I'm Chris Yukins. I'm a professor at George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the sixth module in our course, United Nations Guidance on Anti-Corruption Procurement. In this module, we'll be talking about the integrity of public officials and bidder employees, and also about corporate compliance. This module is not about the integrity of public officials and the integrity of bidder employees. It is instead a module about the intersection of public officials and bidder employees. As was discussed in previous modules, a common pattern is for the government to establish a general code of ethics and then a more stringent supplementary code for procurement officials because of the special risks of corruption that procurement presents. The question then is how private firms interacting with those government officials will both respect and integrate those ethical rules. In other words, how should private firms help the government avoid corruption? As the elements of this module show, the answer to that question rests to a large extent on corporate compliance efforts, structured efforts, sometimes called corporate self-cleaning, by private firms to ensure that their employees follow anti-corruption requirements. Although these compliance efforts could, in principle, be used to conform to any norm or rule and could as well be used by public agencies, as a practical matter, these efforts have centered in private corporations, and those private compliance efforts relate primarily to anti-corruption rules. We'll be discussing those rules in more detail further on in this module. What frames this overall discussion is a clear expectation that procurement personnel will maintain superior standards of integrity and moral values, driven in part by the fact that taxpayer funds are being spent for public purposes and procurement officials oversee that spending. Ethics in public procurement is based on fundamental principles that are reflected in the UN Convention Against Corruption: transparency, competition, objectivity in decision making, integrity, non-discrimination, all the other elements we've been discussing in previous modules. Procurement personnel are expected to act in a manner so as to maintain trust and confidence in the integrity of the acquisition process. This is an important point. The anti-corruption measures we've been discussing not only reduce the performance risk for the government, but they also reduce the reputational risk for the government. They help reinforce the legitimacy of the government doing the purchasing. The legal framework regarding public procurement, as well as the criminal law that accompanies it, is highly complex in every country. Both public and private sectors have to be appropriately informed and trained on how to comply with these legal frameworks. Procurement personnel have to adhere to applicable legislation as well as internal policies and practices at their agencies. Procurement personnel must be informed about what is prohibited and permitted. At the same time, private sector employees must adhere to public rules in dealing with public officials. To do so, typically corporations, contractors will set up the compliance systems we'll be talking about over the next few minutes. So to put these corporate compliance programs in context, the purpose of a robust compliance program in public procurement is to allow a contractor, a corporation typically, to prevent, identify, and combat corruption. Essentially, it's a means by which the corporation, which is acting in public procurement markets, can early identify and address emerging issues of corruption or other forms of illegal behavior inside the corporation. Article 8 of the UN Convention Against Corruption calls for implementation of codes of conduct for public officials. Compliance systems set up inside contractor corporations allow those corporations to ensure that their own employees will comply with those public codes. Now, similar anti-corruption codes and similar anti-corruption compliance requirements are emerging worldwide. So if one were to look at, for example, the guidance from the International Chamber of Commerce under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, the guidance issued by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. When we look at the Ministry of Justice guidance under the UK Bribery Act, or at the OECD guidance, or at the guidance issued under the Sapin II law in France, or under Mexico's latest anti-corruption law. All these bodies of law point to the same basic structure for corporate compliance. We'll discuss that next. So what's required for a compliance program? Again, these requirements are largely uniform around the world, whether you look at Brazil or Mexico, at Germany, at the United States, at the UK, France. Countries around the world are requiring similar compliance efforts on the parts of contractors working in public markets. So once a compliance system is set up in one country, since the requirements are common across countries and across regions, it's possible to use this same compliance system worldwide. The most important first element is a commitment from senior leadership. A compliance program can be expensive, and if senior leadership in the company doesn't support a compliance program, as a practical matter, it's going to be impossible to implement it in the corporation. The corporation has to engage in an individualized risk assessment. This means both assessing individuals who might be coming into the corporation and might pose corruption risks. It also means effectively assessing markets in which the company is moving, because some markets pose greater corruption risk than others. It means setting up explicit written policies and procedures, a code of conduct. It's very typical if you're looking at a multinational corporation, the multinational corporation will publish its code of conduct on the internet. That code of conduct then becomes a model that other competitors in the industry can look to and as they improve their own compliance systems. There has to be oversight, autonomy, and resources. And this means in practice that at least on an annual basis, sometimes more frequently, corporations will review their compliance programs to make sure that they're effective and whether or not, and to assess whether or not additional resources have to be applied. There have to be enforcement and disciplinary guidelines, and that means that if an employee violates the requirements of the compliance system, the employee may face disciplinary action. There has to be the designated compliance infrastructure. And this is something that was, for example, most recently emphasized by the U.S. Department of Justice's Criminal Division. That the compliance superstructure, the compliance structure within a corporation, to a certain extent has to maintain independence from management in order for it to provide objective advice and sometimes aggressive advice in dealing with corruption issues that emerge within a corporation. There has to be an implementation of policies governing third parties. That means if, for example, suppliers pose corruption risk, or if suppliers may be demanding kickbacks, that there has to be a compliance system in place to address third parties as well, those outside the corporation. And typically that's done by sharing the compliance plan or the compliance requirements from the corporation. Again, those may well be published on the internet, and asking the third parties, let's say suppliers or consultants, to subscribe to the terms of that compliance program. Again, there has to be monitoring and auditing on a regular basis to make sure that the system remains compliant and effective. And there has to be periodic review and testing. This might be an annual meeting, for example, of those involved in the compliance program to review the types of complaints that have come up and to ensure that the compliance program is properly able to deal with the run-of-the-mill complaints that are coming up and also the extraordinary issues that may arise because of, for example, changes in the corporation's business. At the heart of a compliance program is the code of conduct, an explicit written policy and procedure setting forth what expectations are of employees. Now, it's possible to have a code of conduct and a compliance system inside a public agency as well, although again, it's more common to see them inside private corporations. And procurement personnel should have those codes available. And as noted, it's very, very common for corporations to publish their codes of conduct on the internet. So you can look to see what other companies are doing. And what other companies are doing in the same market serves as a benchmark for what's an effective program in that given market. The codes of conduct have to be clear and concise and accessible to all employees and to those conducting business on behalf of the government or the company that's setting up the compliance system. The code of conduct should convey the applicable laws and regulations, principal values, and standards, and have to identify prohibited and permissible activities and expected conduct. This is challenging for a multinational corporation, which may be working under many different legal regimes in different countries. That's why oftentimes if you look at the code of conduct for a company that's doing work in many, many jurisdictions, the code of conduct may be very broadly drafted, for example, to bribe gifts or bribery in general, and it may even have supplements on a country-specific basis. The code of conduct should cover gifts, hospitality, entertainment, travel, political contributions, charitable donations, sponsorships, and use of the third parties, other things that are likely to arise in the course of business for the company doing business in any given country. Oftentimes, compliance programs, codes of conduct lean towards the cautious. So, for example, it's not uncommon to see in compliance programs a requirement that employees not give any gifts at all to public employees. That's not because gifts are necessarily prohibited in every country. There are going to be oftentimes de minimis exceptions, small gifts that can be given to public employees within the codes of conduct of any given country. But the corporate code of conduct, the corporate compliance system, because it has to deal with multiple jurisdictions and is difficult to monitor employees in multiple jurisdictions, oftentimes will take the safer path and just bar gifts entirely. So it's very common to see in these codes of conduct directions on how to deal with gifts or gratuities for procurement personnel. For example, there might be discussion if whether or not door prizes would be acceptable at conferences if those door prizes were available to all attendees. But a tablet and computer given to every 10th public employee at a conference might not be acceptable. What happens is that the codes of conduct track the public ethics rules. And for example, this example here, if a tablet employee is in fact given only to public employees, because it's only given to every 10th public employee, the corruptive effect is going to be diluted, but still you know that all the tablets are being given only to public employees. And so it's going to raise questions under the ethics codes. The ethics codes will be deeply concerned, as the corporate compliance system should be, about any measures, any gifts, any money, any computer tablets being given to public employees that could distort the public employees' decision making. What's critically important in a compliance program is to ensure effective communications and training. Policies and procedures can't be effective without that training, and consistently compliance requirements around the world call for this types of training. What is anathema to any corporate compliance program is a paper-based compliance program, which is just a compliance program set forth in a code of conduct, but that really isn't very effective in practice. Key personnel should be trained and they should be evaluated regularly. And the training should be applied to new hires as well as to existing employees. Training programs should be tailored to the company's specific needs, circumstances, roles, and responsibilities. So too should it be tailored if an agency sets up a compliance program. It's important to focus on the theoretical background as well as hypothetical specific to particular day-to-day work. The theoretical background or a theoretical construct or structure will allow the employees to understand why they're being required to follow certain rules. Certification should be obtained from all directors, officers, employees that they've taken the training, and where third parties are being asked to comply with the compliance system, they too should be asked to certify. The training programs should be assessed periodically to ensure that they're effective in bolstering the compliance program. As noted, the compliance program should include a designated compliance infrastructure. It should allow personnel to make reports about potential or actual misconduct into a compliance system. This is typically under a person designated as the Chief Compliance Officer. Best practices suggest that anonymous reports should be allowed, either to hotlines or to an ombudsman, perhaps dropping in the mailbox. Now, there are practical and legal problems with anonymous reports, but in general, as an international best practice, by allowing anonymous reports, there's almost certain to be a greater reporting of problems that are emerging inside the corporation. It's very important that personnel not fear retribution or retaliation for making reports in good faith. It's important to note as well that outside these compliance requirements, if, for example, there are threats against a corporate employee because a corporate employee was a whistleblower, there may be collateral or increased sanctions, for example, under the World Bank sanction system. So it's important that whistleblowers, personnel who are making reports, not fear retribution or retaliation. The compliance infrastructure has to respect certain procedural rights, such as the right for those accused to respond to reports, the right to conduct appropriate investigations by the corporation, the right to document the procuring entities or the company's response. All of these are important procedural steps to ensure the legitimacy and the integrity of the compliance system. So let's shift gears here and talk about some of the typical requirements we're going to see in a public procurement ethics system. What are the types of rules that will be applied to public employees who are working in public procurement to ensure that there's no corruption emerging in the public procurement system? One important principle is the dual control principle. It's sometimes referred to as the 4 eyes principle, which means that important decisions should be made by more than one person. Important decisions should be made, in many systems, made by a commission. This would include approval of tender documents, such as qualification, selection, and award criteria. A bid opening session would be overseen by more than one official. Exclusion of bidders would be subject to the four eyes principle. The awarding decision, of course, would be a critical issue that should be reviewed by more than one person, or the decision to cancel a tender procedure. Again, because of the sensitivity and the potential impact and the potential corruption, this should be subject to the four eyes principle, reviewed by more than one person. The signatory rules are important complements to this as well, that if there are important decisions that are made and decisions that are susceptible to possible corruption, there should be the signature or approval of a high-level official as well, an overseeing official, to make sure that corruption doesn't taint a process. So let's talk some more about some practical examples types of measures that can be taken in public procurement to reduce the risk of corruption. And again, the corporate compliance systems will complement this from the corporate side. So a public agency will oftentimes use representation rules regarding who can be representative of the public agency on a procurement, and include substitution plans so the knowledge and expertise isn't bundled in one person, that multiple persons would be working on a project to reduce the risk of corruption or the risk of abuse of power. Job rotation is another common strategy. By moving officials between jobs, reducing the risk that they gain too much power in any single position. But there is a risk of a loss of expertise and know-how by rotating officials among positions. There's going to be public provisions regarding secondary employment and conflicts of interest, and these can raise serious concerns for contractors who may be hiring those employees. In some markets, for example, it's common to ask employees who are coming out of the public sector and into the contractor workforce that those former public officials fill out questionnaires explaining what they've been doing in the public sector, so that the private company hiring them can make a fair assessment about whether or not they pose risks of conflicts of interest or other types of corruption. There should be an obligation to notify the employer on the part of public employees. There should be a standardization of tender documents or contracts. Normally, the tender documents or contracts are standardized in order to create administrative efficiencies, but it also has a collateral benefit. By using standardized documentation, it reduces the risk of corruption because it becomes easier to exercise oversight about other contracts if the terms are standardized and predictable. The regulations concerning deviations from the standard should set up a process for oversight and approval by senior officials in case a lower level official is trying to manipulate standards or manipulate standard terms in order to gain a corrupt advantage. There should be rules regarding the evaluation of bids, and those rules regarding evaluation should try to reinforce transparency and objectivity, the principles we've been talking about all along in the context of the UN Convention Against Corruption. And the rules should set up a sequence of steps through the procurement process. Oftentimes, the sequence of steps can be manipulated by a corrupt official, and it's important to ensure that the normal sequence is followed, again, to facilitate oversight over the procurement process, both by officials inside the government and also by members of civil society outside the government, or even potential vendors as well, who might bring a big challenge if they see a breakdown in the normal sequence. There are other common strategies that are developed in public procurement systems to address possible corruption. So, for example, rules regarding explanations of bids, how a bidder, for example, might be asked to describe why its offered price is reasonable or why its bid is not considered abnormally low. An abnormally low tender raises performance risk if the contractor can't perform at the price bid, but also raises questions about the legitimacy of the overall process. The systems are often set up as well to address price fixing. So there's oftentimes a system set up within the procurement process to allow for price comparison. So to identify, for example, outrider prices, and to question the bidders as to why there are those outlier prices. Oftentimes detailed rules developed regarding how to develop adequate documentation to provide compliance with applicable rules. So, for example, put it most simply, a contractor might be required either during the bidding process or after award to proffer its own corporate compliance system so that the government can review the measures that the contractor is taking to ensure that it remains above corruption. There should be detailed rules for billing and accounting, including an invoice audit process. The payment process is oftentimes subject to corruption. So, for example, if payment is stalled so that officials who would control the payment process can demand a bribe, it's important to normalize the payment process. For example, there can be a requirement that payment be made within 30 or 60 days so that officials inside the payment process can't use their position to leverage a bribe from a contractor. There should be detailed rules for the award of additional works and services, because in the context of an established relationship, if there are additional works or services ordered, if there's a modification of the contract, that's another opportunity for corruption. So oftentimes there are very detailed rules in a procurement system regarding what might otherwise be a major modification to a contract. Those rules will discuss the needs for transparency and for objectivity and for limitations on those modifications to ensure that there isn't corruption at the time of a contract modification. We hope you've enjoyed this module on efforts to ensure that public employees and private employees act with probity, they act with integrity in the public procurement process. Also a discussion today of corporate compliance systems. As you've seen, these anti-corruption efforts in procurement are advancing in parallel in countries all over the world. And we appreciate the time you've taken today to learn more about these important measures to ensure the integrity in the public procurement process. Thank you.